The Versailles Treaty needs no introduction, probably. It's one of the most notorious peace treaties of all time, certainly of modern times. And I think it's worth asking why that is. It's synonymous with a certain type of spectacular failure, you might say, a failure to be successful in imposing a lasting peace, a treaty often blamed for the outbreak of the Second World War 20 years later. Reparations is something I'm going to touch on, the reparations imposed on Germany in particular, although not only on Germany, are one of the kind of hot button or touchstone issues that people associate with Versailles. It's strange, because reparations were not exactly new. The idea of imposing an indemnity or a kind of a penalty payment on the defeated powers has a very old and long history. They did the same thing to France after the Napoleonic Wars, to France again after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, after the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78. The Germans, in fact, this is one of the most remarkable aspects of the story of the end of the First World War. The Germans had actually just imposed reparations on Russia several months previously to the end of the war. And that, in and of itself, I think, helps to explain a lot of the disconnect and the reasons why the treaty in the end was so unsuccessful. Now, on the Western Front, to give a brief tour of the way things stood at the end of the war, which I think helps to kind of frame and set up the discussion, the arrival of the Americans in force, along with the master of the Allies, who had actually mastered and deployed the tank in a way that the Germans never succeeded in doing in the war, had succeeded in the end in breaking the German lines. And there was a certain breakdown in German morale, uptick in desertions and so on. There was certainly a victory of sorts on the Western Front. But it was a victory that was not really accompanied by anything remotely resembling victory on the Eastern fronts. In fact, on the Eastern fronts of the war, it's important to remember Germany essentially had won the First World War. Russia had dropped out of the war. In some sense, the American intervention really had canceled out, you might say, the Russian dropping out of the war in 1917. But as far as the Eastern Front, I think this helps to explain why the Germans had such an explosive reaction to the harsh peace treaty imposed upon them, even the harsh terms of the armistice, although not as harsh as the treaty, the armistice of 11 November. Up until that moment, the Germans had been told, and quite sensibly believed, that they had been winning the war. If you actually looked at the East, they had carved up the Russian Empire at Brest-Litovsk. They had imposed, actually, their own reparations on Russia, some of which had actually been paid in September 1918, including 2 massive shipments of gold. So that the Germans felt they had won. In fact, the Germans had 1 million troops occupying the carcass of what had been the Russian Empire in 1918. They had 600,000 troops in Ukraine alone. Now, it's true that those troops were not necessarily front-line battalions. A lot of them were what the Germans called Landsturm, or kind of slightly older troops, a lot of them men in their 40s who weren't really seen as fit for front-line duty. But the fact remains that the Germans had essentially won the war in the East. Their allies had won as well. Their allies had also imposed their own terms at Brest-Litovsk, including the Ottomans. In fact, one of the odder tidbits of the end of the war that I'm always quite fond of shocking people with, when the war ended, there were actually Ottoman troops occupying Baku on the Caspian Sea. And there was actually a detachment of Ottoman troops who had wheeled north along the Caspian and occupied the Dagestani capital of Machachkala, as it was then called. I say that simply because I like saying the word, Machachkala. So they were a little bit like those eponymous Japanese troops at the end of the Second World War who had been bypassed in the island hopping. Someone had to come and tell them that the war was over. And in fact, you've lost, even though you've actually gone far into enemy territory. The Germans in 1918 hadn't just occupied Ukraine. There was actually a kind of early echelon in expeditionary detachment, which made it as far as the Volga, to a town then called Tsaritsyn, which you might better know by its World War II appellation as Stalingrad. So you wonder where somebody like Adolf Hitler got his ideas about Lebensraum in the East from. There it is on the map in 1918. So the Germans didn't really feel entirely like they had been defeated. They had, in fact. I mean, if you actually look at what happens on the fronts, they had lost. There was a generalized collapse both on the west and even to some extent in the southeast, where the Macedonian front had collapsed. This is a totally forgotten front that almost never gets talked about, although it's somewhat a positive in that the war had actually begun in the Balkans. In a sense, it also ended there. What had happened there was largely that the Bulgarians had ceased to fight, in part because they were a little bit bitter about not having been given their own fair share of the carcass of Imperial Russia. So when the Bulgarians collapsed, this basically opened up basically the path up through the Balkans into southeastern and then central Europe.